Hello again and welcome to our first lecture in our program on American literature. My name is Fuzi Slisli and I am your instructor for this semester. Our lecture today, this is lecture number 1, and we will look at extracts from a very famous book called A People's History of the United States of America by a historian, Howard Zinn. This is a very important book because it has tried to open the discussion about the history of the United States and try to tell that story from a new perspective, from a perspective that was unusual for American culture. And it helps us to open a historical framework in which we can study our literary texts. So let's begin. So, A People's History of the United States. In your PowerPoint presentations that you can download, you will find a link to the entire book. You can also find a PDF copy of Chapter 1, which is this lecture will focus on. This lecture will focus on Chapter 1 only, but there is a link here to the entire book which you can download. I hope you will be interested to read more chapters in this book because it's a fascinating read, but this lecture will focus only on Chapter 1, which is Columbus, the Indians, and Human Progress. Let us begin first of all by looking at the title of this book, A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. So the title, let's look at this title a little bit closer, A People's History of the United States. The book tells the history of the United States, but not from the perspective of the government and not from the perspective of official historians. What the book tries to do is to tell the history of the United States from the perspective of the victims of American history. Howard Zinn tells the history of the United States from the perspective of those social groups whose voices have been silenced in official history. Voices like women's voices, ethnic minorities' voices, Native Americans' voices, enslaved Africans, immigrants, and the rural and urban working class. These voices in official histories and government histories, these voices tend to be silenced and absent, right? And what Howard Zinn is trying to do in this book is give these voices that are silent in official histories to give them a voice in his book. This is why he calls it A People's History of the United States. It's not an official history, it's not a government history, it's a people's history of the United States. Let's look a little bit in detail at Chapter 1, Columbus, the Indians, and Human Progress. It's a very important chapter because it gives us an idea about the first contact that happened between Europeans and Native Americans. How did the first contact happen? And did this first contact establish a pattern which will be followed for the remainder of American history, especially in the treatment of Native Americans? Hopefully, this presentation will answer that question. So, Chapter 1. Columbus, the Indians, and Human Progress. Chapter 1 describes the arrival in 1492 of Spanish explorer Christopher Columbus in America. So Chapter 1 describes the arrival of Christopher Columbus. He's a Spanish explorer, and he arrives in America in 1492. You might or might not know that 1492 is also the year of the fall of Granada, the last Muslim kingdom in Al-Andalus. So 1492 was the year in which Granada fell, Mamlakat Gharnata. And that same year, Christopher Columbus sails from Spain, now it's Christian Spain, and crosses the ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, hoping to reach what he called the Indies. At that time, Europeans called China, Japan, and India the Indies. So he didn't know there was a continent in the middle of the ocean. He simply thought that if he sails west and crosses the Atlantic Ocean, he will come back from the east, because this is the time when Europeans accepted the idea that the earth was round. So if someone sails west, they will eventually emerge from the east. So he thought to go to China or Japan or India, he doesn't need to go east and cross the Mediterranean. He can just cross the Atlantic and go west, and he will emerge in what he called the Indies, which is the name that Europeans gave at that time to China, Japan, and India. So when Columbus landed in the Americas, he believed he had reached the Far East. He thought he was, in the islands off the coast of India and China. Columbus was hoping to find gold. Part of the deal he had with the King and Queen of Spain, who funded his voyage, was that he would find gold. He was greeted by Arawak Indians on the Bahama Islands. The Arawaks are Native Americans. They were very kind and hospitable to him and his men, which contrasted with the way, it contrasted with European greed and hunger for profit, which characterized the 15th century and which characterized Columbus's mission, because Columbus was focused on finding gold. So the Arawaks are kind, hospitable, and it contrasts with the spirit and the culture of Europe that was very much based on greed and hunger for profit. This is the emergence, the beginnings of the capitalist system taking shape. Spain, along with other European nations at that time, had recently become a modern nation state. Its leaders searched for gold as the new mark of wealth, simply because gold, unlike land, this is the 15th century, they discovered gold, that gold is wealth. Because unlike land, you can just carry it and go. So if you have gold, you can transport it. But if you own land, you can't transport land. So in the 15th century, late 15th century and 16th century, Europeans realized the value of gold. And a race began between all these emerging European countries for the accumulation of gold. Its leaders in Spain searched for gold as the new mark of wealth. Spanish royalty promised Columbus, the King and Queen of Spain, promised Columbus a new title, that he would get a new title, which was Admiral of the Seas. Admiral of the Seas. And he eventually got his title because he discovered the Americas and, came back with slaves and, So they promised him a new title, Admiral of the Seas, and promised him governing privileges of any land he discovered if he found gold. So any new land he finds, they promised him that they would let him govern that land on their behalf, of course. So Columbus is greeted by the Arawaks off the island of the Bahamas Islands. And being so obsessed and on target about finding gold, he begins by asking for gold. When Native Americans say, well, we don't know what you're talking about, he starts by kidnapping several Arawaks and insisted that they show him where the gold was. I mean, you have to imagine that these poor Native Americans at this time don't even know the value of gold. Columbus and his man find that Native Americans do have some jewelries in gold, in their nose or in their ears, but they're in small quantities. So he insisted that they show him where he can find that metal, gold, in big quantities. They showed him where they can find them, but it was in very small quantities in rivers. And at some point, Columbus started thinking that they're lying to him. So he kidnapped a group of them and started torturing them, insisting that they show him where the gold was. When he didn't get anywhere, he sailed to an island which he called Hispaniola. This is the island we call today Haiti or the Dominican Republic. It's an island that has two countries today. One we call Haiti and the other we call the Dominican Republic. So he sails to this island, he calls it Hispaniola, and he builds there the first European military base in the Western Hemisphere. He built it from one of the ships that he was in. Columbus sailed with 3 ships and used one of them to build a military fort. He continued to imprison Indians and torture them, hoping they would tell him where he could find the gold. In his reports to the Spanish king and queen, Columbus lied and said the islands were full of gold and he just needed help and reinforcement to find it. When he couldn't find any gold, he kidnapped Indians and sent them to Europe to be sold as slaves. He also forced enslaved Indians to work in mines and on plantations, and it was very hard forced labor. They basically worked these Indians to death, and some of them could not last more than 6 months doing heavy labor, and then they would die. The Indians naturally fought back. They fought Columbus and his men back, but the Indians had spears and arrows and bones and rocks. The Spanish had cannons, they had muskets, they had knives, they had swords, they had firearms, right? So the Indians fought back first, but they were no match to the Spaniards. Then the Indians started running away, and when the Spaniards come close to a village, they find it empty, completely deserted. Then the Indians started committing suicide on a large scale. They would rather die than be captured by the Spaniards. And in this way, half of Haiti's native population died in 2 years. Okay, we need to talk a little bit about these mass murders that the Spaniards committed in the Indies. And we learn about them. They've been documented, first of all, in Columbus's own diary, because he kept a diary as a captain, and it is surprisingly very detailed, and he describes all the horrors and the crimes that he committed. We have another source by a Spanish priest called Bartolomé de las Casas. He was born in 1484 and died in 1566. He was a Spanish priest. Bartolomé las Casas was a vocal critic of Columbus and recorded for us the crimes and the massacres that Columbus and his men committed in the Americas. He recorded these events in a book he called History of the Indies. So it's a short book. It's available. I have a copy. History of the Indies. And here Las Casas describes the Indians as a peaceful, generous society. He shows how generous they are in sharing, how they don't have weapons, and although they do wage war, but they don't have any destructive weapons, and war is rather ritualistic rather than for the purpose of killing. He shows how they willingly share things they have, and if you tell them, I like this, they would just give it to you. And describes how Spain behaved in a cruel and treacherous fashion with the Native Americans. Las Casas' reports are confirmed by Columbus's own diaries. So Howard Zinn gets us to this point to ask the very important question: whose history do we read when we read history books? He attracts our attention here to the fact that Columbus, in spite of his crimes, is celebrated in modern history books as a hero and a great explorer. Historians often ignore crimes committed in the past and atrocities committed in the past, either through lies or through quiet omission. And when you read history books, you do find sometimes the history books referring to some crimes or massacres, but sometimes they're treated quietly as, it was necessary. Or sometimes they are just omitted or lied about. And a lot of this happens in history books about the early history of America. So official historians may mention Columbus's mass murders, but they don't treat them as important. And Howard Zinn shows how historians don't tell the whole story of the Europeans' arrival in the Americas. By highlighting some facts and burying others, historians support an ideology or a system of belief. And according to Howard Zinn, American historians emphasize their nation's greatness and progress and excellence and ignore its extermination and massacres of the Native American populations. Historical accounts and educational texts often treat genocide, mass murder, and other atrocities as a deplorable but necessary price to pay for progress in the past and even today in the present. So yes, official histories sometimes, they don't hide it. They say, yes, there were massacres, there was genocide, but it was necessary, It was necessary to achieve progress and to build such a great nation like the one we have. One contemporary historian describing the destruction of a native population said you cannot make up an omelette without breaking eggs. So that gives you an idea how history as a discipline treats atrocities and mass murders and genocide that happened in history. And this is what Howard Zinn is trying to highlight in this book, in this first chapter, by laying the ground to show us that he wants to tell the history of those voices that are silenced, those voices that didn't get to speak, to tell their story. So clearly, he's telling us that history is written by the winners. The official history of the United States, according to Howard Zinn, has been told from the point of view of governments, conquerors, diplomats, and leaders. The stories of the victims, the weak, the voiceless, like the stories of Native Americans, are often lost forever. Zinn describes how English and Spanish leaders conquered the indigenous people in Mexico, Peru, and North America. Spanish explorer Hernando Cortés, 1485-1547, also lived in the same period, So Hernando Cortés strategically murdered the Aztecs of Mexico. It was systematic work of extermination. Francisco Pizarro, another Spanish explorer, created a capitalist system of exploitation in Peru. English settlers in Jamestown, Virginia, worked to exterminate the Powhatan people's chief Powhatan and his tribe, despite the Powhatan's pleas for friendly treatment. So the Powhatans in Jamestown in Virginia, this is in the area we call Virginia today in the United States, the Powhatan people begged for friendly treatment and good neighborly relations. But the English colonists, the English settlers, systematically just exterminated them. When the English Puritans arrived at Massachusetts Bay in 1620, this is the first English colony in North America, 1620, they used verses from the Bible to claim a right to the land. So they used the Bible to say that this land is ours. It was given to us by God. The tension between the Puritan settlers and the Pequot Indians led to a war in 1636. This is 16 years after the Puritans arrived in North America. The Pequot Indians were a nation, and immediately there were clashes, and a war broke in 1636. The Puritans used a strategy that future leaders of the United States would continue. So the pattern that the Puritans start in 1636 in their war on the Indians will be continued by future leaders of the United States all the way to the present. They killed not only Indian fighters, they exterminated all their civilians, non-combatant populations, and so on. I mean, when I say until today, it doesn't mean that wars and massacres are going on today, but wars and massacres continued until late in the 19th century. And then isolation and destruction by disease and addiction and impoverishment continued on Native American reservations. And that's a story that continues until today. Let's talk a little bit about the myth of progress, because it's this idea of progress that historians use to justify these atrocities. So they say, yeah, these were horrible atrocities, but they were necessary to achieve progress. And Howard Zinn questions the common idea in America that the genocide of the Indians was necessary to progress from savagery to civilization. He questions the idea that this is the price for civilization. The destruction of the Indians, he says, didn't lead to a better world. It is not true that Indian societies were savage. They were advanced in their own right, in their own way. Some of them had complex agriculture, some of them had complex architecture, they had peaceful relations with one another, and they had a moral communal system which did not include private property. The Indians did not know private property. When the Europeans came and asked the Indians, can we buy land from you? The Indians were shocked. They said, the earth is our mother, and you don't sell your mother, you don't buy your mother. We don't own the earth, we are part of the earth. The earth is our mother. Indian societies also gave rights and independence to women and children. By contrast, European societies at that time were driven by greed and power, and a power structure emphasizing the leadership of wealthy males. Zinn compares these two models of civilizations to question the excuse of progress that led to the annihilation of many races and many nations. Howard Zinn frames Columbus's conquest of the Americas within the larger picture of Western civilization. After the Renaissance, the new nation-states of Europe, Spain, England, France, Holland, these new nation-states and their leaders were driven by a desire to accumulate wealth. The medieval system of feudalism in Europe, where workers served rich landowners, influenced the version of capitalism in the New World. So in the same way that in the medieval period under feudalism, the vast majority of the people were serfs and served the rich, the aristocrats, that same system was taken to the New World, and on its basis capitalism was created. Columbus brought European attitudes towards land ownership to the Americas. The United States would follow this model in its early colonies and in the plantations of the American South. Another trend that Zinn identifies, and this is just a short analysis here, is the concepts of imperialism and capitalism. Another trend that Zinn identifies in the early conquest of the Americas is imperialism, which is a system where one country rules over other countries and controls their wealth. We call that imperialism. Because imperialism can be fueled by a need to profit from other countries' material wealth, imperialism and capitalism are connected because they're built on maximizing profit from other people's wealth. So it leads to one country controlling another country to exploit and steal their wealth. So in that sense, we see the connection between imperialism and capitalism and profit. Columbus was motivated by the promise of financial rewards and the promise of status. His approach contrasts with the Indians' culture of sharing, an economy of sharing and of generosity. This is a model that Howard Zinn finds more ethical and sustainable. He even would say more civilized. It might not have material wealth, but it has values and it has sharing culture and generosity. Finally, imperialist conquerors often justify their actions by claiming a divine mission. Usually they claim they're doing something sacred in the name of God. And that's characteristics of imperialist conquests throughout history. They're very often justified, they justify their actions by claiming a divine or sacred mission from God. Columbus's constant reference to the Bible comes with a sense of destiny and divine approval, that God approves what he is doing. He orders the sale of slaves in the name of the Holy Trinity, in the name of Jesus Christ. This language is reflected in the Manifest Destiny when American leaders conquered the western frontier and described it as a religious and sacred mission. That brings us to the end of this lecture on Howard Zinn and a people's history of the United States. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope it sent you to do more research and learn more about the subject. Thank you for watching. My name is Fouzi Slisli. Have a nice evening.